So today we're going to run through communicating with your landlord. And in our observation, the landlord is generally the last to know if something's going wrong. You might be paying your rent up to date, or you might be a little bit behind, but generally a lot of people don't talk to their landlord if things are going wrong, or they wait until it's too late. Now, unfortunately for a lot of businesses, the commercial leases are severely in favour of the landlord, and the landlord holds most of the cards. And if you are in breach of your lease, the ability of the landlord to turf you out of a property is quite high. But a lot of people forget that, and they simply think that the landlord will do a deal with them. Now, in our experience, we've dealt with a lot of motel leases in particular. It came as a shock to tenants when they found out that the landlord could terminate the lease only with 7 days' notice and push them out of the property, and as well take control of basically their business being the motel leasehold interest. Now, it's equally the same in the pub industry. A lot of hotel operators didn't realise that the landlord had full control, and if he worked out that he wasn't going to get paid his rent, he could take possession of your business. Now, if your business is lease dependent, then the landlord holds all the cards, and it's something that you need to be in charge of. But for a lot of other businesses, the location can change. And what we're going to run through today is dealing with the landlord where the control is more in your hands. So in dealing with the landlord, we always say the same thing: be upfront and be honest. So make it very clear to the landlord what's going on, what you need, and how your business is going to survive. Now, if the lease is one of the biggest problems for your business and the landlord's not willing to drop the rent, then realistically you can't stay in that place. And it doesn't matter what you do in order to continue to improve your business. If the lease is a problem, nothing will change. So if your landlord says to you, "I'm not dropping the rent under any circumstance," then you need to say, "Well, this business is not for me." And in a later session, we actually run through the motel industry, because it's one in particular where the landlords were merely unwilling to drop the rent under any circumstance. And as a result, they had a lot of tenants fall over. And it took, in the case of one of the people we dealt with, 25% of their properties to go into insolvent events before they would actually take steps to drop the rent. So it's important when you're talking to your landlord to know what's happening on the ground. And by that we mean what's actually going on in the strip you're in the area you're in, or in the city you're in. So if you're in a shopping strip and there's vacancies all around you, you can go to your landlord and say, "Well, the rest of the strip is vacant, why should I stay? What incentive are you going to give me in order to stay in this location? Because there's plenty of other options around." Now, unfortunately, some landlords can be quite difficult to deal with and say, "Well, I don't care what's happening on the ground. You have a lease, you're stuck." Now, if that's the case, there's options available to you, but in the most part, an unwilling landlord can be very difficult to deal with. But if you go in prepared and say, "Well, this is what it looks like on the ground. This is what the financial position is. This is what the tenancy rates are. This is what the mix of businesses are," and you say to them, "Things have got to change," then at least you've got some information to work with. If you're looking for rent relief or a rent reduction, then give them comparatives. So go in well armed. Say to them, "The shop next door is renting for half the price," or "He got a 6-month incentive," or "He got a 12-month incentive," or "There's so many vacant shops around." If you walk in there with comparatives and you say to your landlord, "I'm paying more than market," a landlord may be willing to consider a rent reduction or a rent relief. But if you walk in with nothing other than saying, "I need the rent dropped," a landlord's going to go, "Well, it's not my problem. Give me something that I need." So if you're going to be preparing to talk to your landlord, you need to be prepared. And that preparation may be talking to local real estate agents, especially commercials. It may be actually just walking around the area, or even ringing up some of the real estate agents and looking to rent different premises. So it's important to understand your position, and by that we mean, what does the lease actually say? Are you stuck with personal guarantees? Do you have a long-term lease that you can't get out of? And are you in a situation where if the landlord doesn't drop the rent, things are going to get worse? So you need to know what your position is. And if that position is bad, you need to take alternate steps. Now, equally, if you're in a long-term lease and everyone around you is falling over, again, you need to understand your position as to why that's happening. So in Sydney at the moment, with the tram lines being the way they are, Towards Haymarket in Sydney, a lot of properties are starting to become vacant because the tenants can no longer afford the rent. Now, in that situation, there hasn't been a lot of rent relief. The landlords don't know what's going on the ground, and they have said, well, I'm owed the rent, I've got personal guarantees, I'm going to enforce. So you need to know what your position is, and you need to be well aware of what your options are. What we often say to people is you need to understand your obligations under the lease. Now, it might be that you're towards the end of the lease, maybe 6 months to go, so you say, well, fine, I'll just pay out the end of the lease and walk away. But do you have things like a make good provision? And does that mean you're going to need to take the property back to the condition it was when you started? Equally, do you walk up to your landlord and say, well, I'm happy to give you a longer lease, but I want some of the terms changed? If you don't understand your responsibilities under the lease, though, you don't know what you're negotiating with. So you can't say to the landlord, well, I want the personal guarantee removed, or I want the bond reduced, or I want some different incentives to keep me in this property. So as a tenant, what are your options really? And one thing to remember is commercial and especially industrial properties are vacant for a very long period of time when they're vacant. No landlord wants a vacant property. So whilst you may not have a lot of power, if you turn around to your landlord and say, well, the alternative is I shut the doors and you're going to have a vacant property, and in maybe 6 months, maybe in 12 months, maybe in a year, maybe 3 years, you might find a tenant, then a landlord may be willing to do a deal. But again, it's important to actually walk in there forewarned, understand what your position is and understand what the market looks like. Now, for a lot of landlords, pushing the rent down is very much a mental thing. They think the value of their asset is dropping, so they're unwilling to drop rents in any significant amount. But others will actually look at a situation and go, well, I prefer to have a full shop than an empty shop. I'd rather have a tenant in place than have an empty shop. Because the problem is that once it's empty, cost of maintenance goes up. They end up spending a lot more than actually having a tenant in situ. It's important to note that a lot of landlords won't shift, and Parramatta Road in Sydney is the best example of this, and it's certainly been well documented that the landlords in that area were never willing to drop the rents. Didn't matter that some of these properties have been vacant for 30 and 40 years. Under no circumstances would they drop the rent. Now, some landlords will say to you, I don't care what your situation is, you're on your own. And certainly we've experienced that, especially in the hospitality industry and more specifically the motel industry, where landlords would say, I will not drop the rent under any circumstance, it's your problem. Now, if your landlord is not going to be your partner in doing this, it may be that your option is to walk away. And certainly what we found in the motel industry was that a lot of tenants simply did walk away because they couldn't afford the rent, their businesses were unsustainable, and if they stayed there, things were not going to get better. So if you are having a situation with your landlord, or you're looking at a restructure and wanting to understand what your options are, feel free to give the team a call on 1300 023 782 or visit our website. We've got a lot of resources available if you're thinking about what your options are under a lease.